So thank you all for joining Straight Science tonight. We really appreciate it. And Straight Science is a public evening seminar put on by UAF Northwest Campus here and Alaska Sea Grant here in Nome. And tonight we have Henna Malek. Henna Malek is no stranger to Straight Science. She is actually, it's her second, and you were in another role with the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission. And she talked about co-management several years ago, and now she's back in her new job with she's the Marine Mammal Specialist for the NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, Alaska Regional Office, Office of Protected Resources. Or I should say, Protected Resources Division, PRD, pardon me. There you go. And we actually are wondering about critical habitat. It's something that's coming up again in our conversations. And we actually have critical habitat in the Bering Strait region. And so since this is a topic that's coming up more publicly soon, Henna is very kind to lend us her time and expertise to sort of bring it home to us. What is critical habitat? And she's got the what, where, when, where, and how of critical habitat. And I know that I have been with marine mammals for many, many years, and I have not been able to wrap my head around critical habitat. So it's important, and why don't you take it away? Thank you, Henna.
Great, thanks, Gay. I appreciate that introduction. So as Gay said, I'm Henna Malek with NOAA Fisheries. And tonight we're going to be talking about the Endangered Species Act and specifically focusing on critical habitat, which, as Gay mentioned, is of interest, especially in the Bering Strait region. So I'm pretty new to the endangered species myself. I get my slides to work here. Oh, maybe not. Okay, Gay, did my slides advance on the screen? Can you confirm, please? Maybe?
Yes. Sorry, I was having some clicking there. We see the slide has 4 pictures and it says a little background on the top. Okay.
Perfect, thanks. So as Gay mentioned, I work for Protected Resources Division, but I've only been with NOAA for just under 2 years now. So part of my portfolio is Endangered Species Act consultations, which we'll learn about later this evening. I also work on harbor seal management, and I do marine mammal co-management with several Alaska Native organizations around the state. And as Gay also mentioned, a couple of years ago, I gave a Straight Science talk in Nome about a co-management review that I worked on with the help of the Eskimo Walrus Commission and several other organizations around the state. So I've had the great chance to come to Nome and go to Savunga and Gamble, which are the photos that you see here. And in another life, about 5 or 6 years ago, I also used to be an oyster ecologist. So that's what I went to grad school for, but now I get to work on marine mammal issues, which is definitely a great experience for me. So I'm pretty new to the Endangered Species Act, and I saw this opportunity to speak about critical habitat because I know how important it is to the Bering Strait region. And I'm hoping that I can help clarify some things with critical habitat and make it seem a little bit more straightforward as you move into this period of learning more about ringed and bearded seal critical habitat, which is, there's going to be public hearings next week for those. So to start off, I want to talk about the Endangered Species Act. And because critical habitat is created through the Endangered Species Act, it's kind of important to understand how all these processes work. So we'll talk about what it is and what it does. And you may hear me refer to the Endangered Species Act as the ESA. And then I'm going to talk about critical habitat under the ESA and what it is and what it isn't, what it actually does, when we designate it, how and where, and then how you, the public, can provide input on critical habitat designation. And then we'll talk about the few examples that we have here in Alaska. So I do want to remind folks that here in Alaska, we have 2 federal agencies that manage wildlife. And NOAA Fisheries, which is my department, we sit in the Department of Commerce, and we are responsible for managing whales, seals, sea lions, dolphins, and porpoises. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service sits in the Department of the Interior, and they are responsible for walruses, polar bears, and sea otters, as well as other listed species such as Steller's eiders. I'm going to be focusing mostly on marine mammals in this presentation because that's what I work on. But both NOAA Fisheries and the Fish and Wildlife Service are responsible for carrying out the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but we are responsible for different species. Everything I'm going to talk to you about tonight in terms of the Endangered Species Act should be pretty similar between the two services, but I won't be able to answer any questions that are specific to fish and wildlife species because those aren't my bailiwick. Okay, so the Endangered Species Act. It's got a bit of a history, and in 1966, Congress passed what was known as the Endangered Species Preservation Act. And this was the first time that there was provided any type of protection for endangered native species in the United States. This was then amended in 1969 to broaden the scope to include prohibiting the importation of endangered species. So it took another step forward, and it was converted into what was called the Endangered Species Conservation Act. This only lasted 4 years because then in December of 1973, President Nixon signed the Endangered Species Act into law. And this did a lot more than either of the other previous acts. A few of the things that it did was require federal agencies to consult on actions that may affect listed species. It also made plants and all invertebrates eligible for protection, and it formally defined endangered and threatened. Now, the Act did a lot more than that, as you'll see in an upcoming slide, but those are some of the important things that it did. It also addressed both domestic and international conservation, and to date, it is the strongest law for protecting biodiversity that's ever been passed by any nation. So here we are about 50 years later, and it's still the strongest thing going. So to me, that's pretty cool. So the ESA has 18 sections. I told you that it did a lot. And interestingly, if you were to read the document, there's no section 1, but they say there's 18 sections. But today we're only going to be really looking at 3 of those. And that'll be section 3, which is definitions, section 4, which describes listing of species under the Endangered Species Act, as well as designation of critical habitat. And then section 7, which is interagency cooperation. So for definitions, it can be hard to determine the difference between endangered and threatened. So for endangered, we're saying something is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And the first species to be listed as endangered in the state of Alaska was the Eskimo curlew, and this took place in 1967, which means it would have technically been listed under the Endangered Species Preservation Act. I'm not entirely sure if this species is actually extinct. I don't think anyone's seen it for a very long time, but this was one of the first species in Alaska to make the list. But then when we talk about threatened, we're talking about likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. And the first species to be listed as threatened under the ESA were spectacled eiders in 1993. And if you look at these two definitions, they might seem kind of similar, but endangered is talking about now, in the present, being on the brink of extinction, whereas threatened is more on the brink of being endangered. So it's more about time. Endangered's more present and more urgent, maybe, than threatened. But again, threatened means it's likely to become endangered. All right, so a little bit more of a maybe definition here is that I'm going to use the term entity as I walk through instead of using species. Because in order to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, you have to has to be either a species, a subspecies, or a distinct population segment. So you have to be one of those 3 entities to be eligible for listing. Now, if I were to say, well, we're going to list this species, it could actually be a subspecies or a DPS that we're talking about, a distinct population segment. So species is kind of misleading. So I'm going to say entity throughout the rest of the talk. However, just to give you a few examples, a species that's listed under the ESA is the bowhead whale, whereas we have listed the subspecies, the Arctic subspecies of ringed seals, and the distinct population segment of Western stellar sea lions, just to give you an idea of the difference between those 3 entities. So how do we list an entity under the ESA? Well, it must be listed as threatened or endangered because of any of the following 5 factors. There has to be either a present or a threatened destruction of their habitat or range. They need to be overutilized for some reason, whether it's commercial overutilization or scientific or educational. There's disease or predation, inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms, so what we have in place just isn't doing the job. Or there might be other natural man-made factors that affect continued existence. So if we think of an example where, let's say there's an amphibian species that lives in one wetland in one isolated area somewhere, let's say in Texas. They'd probably be frozen right about now, but they live in this one wetland and someone wants to put a water treatment plant in an area that's going to drain into that wetland. So here we are creating this man-made structure that could be polluting the water in which this amphibian lives and causing, affecting its continued existence. So how do we decide to list, how do we go about listing an entity? So we know that it's either a species, a subspecies, or a distinct population segment. It meets one or any of those 5 criteria we just discussed. So how do we list it? Well, first, we can be petitioned. So someone can petition NOAA Fisheries or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list an entity, and either organizations can do this or individuals. So if you have a case that you want a certain entity listed, you can petition us. The other option is that one of the services voluntarily decides to take a closer look at a species using a species status review. I'm going to be honest, most of the listings that we look at now come from petitions. So there is a petitioning process, and I'm going to try to go through this as painlessly as possible. But once we receive a petition, we conduct what's called a 90-day review. And so we have 90 days to look at this petition and say, would a reasonable person look at this and say, yeah, you know what, maybe we should consider listing this entity? The answer to that question is no. We put out what's called a negative 90-day finding, and we explain why we don't think that action is warranted or should go forward, and that's it. However, if we are convinced that a reasonable person would say, yeah, let's take a closer look at this, we put out a positive finding, and then we ask for public comment. We collect the scientific and commercial information from the public to better our understanding of this position that this entity is in. And we use that to review the best available information. And from that species status review, we then come out with either a 12-month finding saying that listing that entity, it's not warranted. We looked at all of this information. Yeah, there's some stuff going on, but we don't think this entity should be listed based on the facts that we have now. Or we come out with a positive or a warranted finding. So yes, we think this should proceed. And if that's the case, we then come out with what's called a proposed rule. And so you may be familiar with this term because there's a proposed rule for critical habitat for bearded and ring seals. The same thing happens when we're listing an entity under the ESA. And once we put this proposed rule out, we again ask for public comment. So you can see there's numerous places where the public can comment on these actions. Depending on the public comment, we may either withdraw the proposed rule or we will publish a final rule. So this would be the listing of the entity. So this is where we would say that entity X is now officially listed under the Endangered Species Act as, let's say, threatened. All right, so that's it. It's listed. It's official. And so here in Alaska, we have quite a few marine mammal species that NMFS is responsible for, or NOAA Fisheries, excuse me, that are either threatened or endangered. And what I've done is I've indicated which of these species either have proposed critical habitat or designated critical habitat. So the pluses mean it's proposed and the asterisk means that it's already in place. And in addition to these species, just for the sake of the Fish and Wildlife Service, polar bears are listed as threatened currently under the Endangered Species Act, and they do have designated critical habitat. And the southwest stock of sea otters, which are found in the Aleutian Islands, are also listed as threatened. But you'll notice for the national or the NOAA fisheries species that only about half of them have either proposed or dedicated critical habitat. And that's because many of these species, the large whale species, were listed back in 1970, technically under the Endangered Species Conservation Act. And regulations state that if a species was listed prior to 1978, it's at our discretion if we want to go back and designate critical habitat. Most of these species were threatened by commercial whaling. And since that is no longer in place, it's not necessary at this point for a lot of them to have critical habitat because they've been doing quite well rebounding on their own. Bowhead whales, for example, have been doing quite well. So we're talking about what species have designated critical habitat. So let's get to the meat of this. What is critical habitat? And I want to address some maybe common misconceptions or just some thoughts about critical habitat. And the name itself is a little bit daunting. The word critical doesn't always have a positive meaning. So if someone says their friend is in the hospital in critical condition, that's not a good thing. That's a scary thing. Or critical failure of some type of equipment that leads to an emergency. So that in and of itself can cause people to pause and think that critical habitat is a much bigger deal than it really is, or that it's more powerful and is more effective or will affect more things than it actually does. So my hope here is to better explain what it actually does do and what it doesn't mean. So let's start there. So critical habitat does not create a refuge, a sanctuary, or a wilderness reserve, or any other type of special conservation area, which would potentially impact how people can use this area. So does not create any of these things. It also does not restrict human activities such as subsistence hunting of marine mammals. That's still allowed. Recreational, subsistence, or commercial fishing, still allowed in critical habitat, as well as recreational boating or wildlife viewing, tourism, that kind of thing. Those are all still allowed within designated critical habitat. Also, when it comes to private ownership of land that is designated as critical habitat, this does not apply to citizens that are engaged in activities on their private land that does not involve a federal agency. So, for example, if you wanted to put a dock, such as the one pictured here, on your private property that is within a designated area, as long as you were paying for this yourself and didn't require a federal permit of any kind, you could certainly do this with no problem whatsoever. Additionally, critical habitat does not mandate that government or public access to private lands is acceptable. So your private property stays private. Additionally, critical habitat designation doesn't affect land ownership either. So big message here is that critical habitat designation doesn't make anything a special conservation area. It doesn't affect human activities, and it doesn't affect anything to do with private land. So what exactly is critical habitat? What I have here is sort of a paraphrased definition of the legal jargon. And what it says is that critical habitat is specific areas within the geographical area occupied by the entity, the listed entity, at the time of listing that contains certain physical and biological features that are essential to conservation and may require special management considerations. Additionally, in some cases, critical habitat can include areas outside of the area occupied at time of listing if the agency determines that that unoccupied area is essential for conservation. So this definition says a lot of things, but there's two really important parts I want to point out. And these are what it means to be essential to conservation and what constitutes a physical or biological feature. So let's talk about those a little more. So essential to conservation can be basically something that allows an entity to live, to do its thing. So they need things like space to grow, to frolic, if you will, to do their normal life activities. Food, water, or other nutritional needs are essential, like we have Pacific cod, which is a preferred prey of many of our ESA-listed species. Requires cover or shelter. Sites for breeding and reproduction is also essential. So the map that is much smaller than I thought it was actually shows humpback whale migratory paths. So as most of you probably know, a lot of humpbacks spend their summer in Alaska, but then they go to warmer waters to breed. So we need to consider what areas are used for these types of activities and how essential this is to the conservation of the species. And lastly, habitats that are protected from disturbance or are representative of a historical, geographic, or ecological distribution may also be considered essential. So what do we mean by physical and biological features? We call these PBFs for short, and for the sake of this slide, I've abbreviated them, but these occur in a specific area and are essential to support the species. And PBFs may include, but are definitely not limited to, things like water characteristics. So the temperature and salinity that are demonstrated in this map here. Additionally, so if you're a plant, soil type might be particularly important, prey and vegetation, and also short-lived or dynamic features such as sea ice that we have here in Alaska are considered to be a physical feature that's essential to conservation. So we have a ring seal that we know relies very heavily on sea ice. So we have these two main points of the definition, which is essential to conservation and physical and biological features. So moving forward, I'm going to just say essential features and kind of combine these two concepts for ease of understanding and ease of talking, because it's a lot to say. So what does critical habitat do? We talked about what it doesn't do and the changes that it doesn't make, but what it does do, this is the big thing, is that critical habitat requires federal agencies to consult with NOAA Fisheries and the Fish and Wildlife Service on federal actions. So basically, it's making federal agencies work together more often, and as you might say, teamwork makes the dream work. So we consult on federal actions, and a federal action needs to have a federal link or a connection, which is if an activity is authorized, funded, or carried out by a federal agency. If it does not meet those criteria, it does not have a federal link and it is not a federal action. But if there is a federal link, then they have to go into what is Section 7 of the ESA with interagency cooperation. And this requires different agencies such as the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BLM, that they need to consult with us to ensure that their activities are not going to destroy or adversely modify designated critical habitat. That is the kind of the meat of what critical habitat does, is it causes the federal agencies to work together more closely, which is great, and to make sure that there's no destruction to critical habitat. They also consult with us on listed entities. So these Section 7 consultations, as we often refer to them, will deal with both the listed entity to make sure that the action is not likely to adversely affect that entity, and to make sure that there's no destruction or adverse modification to critical habitat. So those things are considered simultaneously. So when do we designate critical habitat, and what is this process? Well, the designation is supposed to take time, or supposed to be finalized at the same time that an entity is listed. But this doesn't always happen. A critical habitat designation might not be prudent for an entity, meaning that habitat might not be the problem of why this entity was listed in the first place. Or it could be that critical habitat is not yet determinable. What does that mean? Not determinable. Well, it means that the data that we have might not be sufficient for conducting our critical habitat analysis. Or if we take into account, let's say, our species X that was just listed, here's what we know about it. Well, we know that it lives in Alaska in the summer. We don't really know what its preferred prey is. We don't really know its population size. And we know that it migrates from Alaska to somewhere, but we don't really know where. So it could be that we just don't have enough biological information about this entity to actually know what its essential features are and where they exist. And so if this is the case, we're able to extend our deadline for designating critical habitat by 1 year, which is why you don't always see critical habitat coming out at the same time as a listing. So sometimes we just don't know. So when designating critical habitat, we use the best scientific information available. So this involves research science, indigenous knowledge, We look at the economic, national security, and other relevant impacts while we're looking through all of this information. So we use a wide variety of information to make this decision, similar to how we decide the information we use to list an entity. And here are the steps that we used for identifying critical habitat. So first, we need to identify the geographical area that's occupied by the entity. So here we have a hypothetical distribution of entity X that we just listed. And all the light blue that you see here, that is where entity X, it can be found, and the black area is where it doesn't live. All right, so we know the geographical area, but now we need to know what are their essential features that we have to figure out and then pinpoint where they belong. So let's say we do our research and we understand that entity X has two major essential features that it needs in order to be conserved and to hopefully recover. So we found that one of these is these yellow dots here that are found off the West Coast, Washington, California area. And that's where essential feature 1 is found. Essential feature 2 is then found up in the Bering Sea and just north of the Bering Strait. So we've isolated where these essential features are within the geographical area of the species. And once we do that, we evaluate the impacts of having critical habitat in these locations and consider if there might need to be possible exclusions. So pretty straightforward process, figuring out where they are, the things that they need, and where the things that they need are in relation to the entity. And once we've determined where these critical habitat areas should be, we put out, again, we propose and say, we're going to put critical habitat in these areas, and we receive public comment. And this process is going on right now for ringed and bearded seals, which I will talk about again a little bit later. And again, we might withdraw the proposed rule if depending on public feedback, or we will say we have officially designated critical habitat to entity X, and here's the description of where it is. Well, speaking of where can critical habitat be designated? Well, it cannot be designated within foreign countries or other areas that are outside of US jurisdiction. So looking again for entity X here, we see that we can't designate anything on the coast of the surrounding continents or Antarctica, Africa, other areas that I didn't point out here, but I think you get the picture. So we can list species that are international, but we cannot designate critical habitat for species that are international. Additionally, areas that are owned or controlled by the US Department of Defense are most generally exempt from critical habitat designation. So, in addition to no international waters, or international areas, I should say, if there's Department of Defense land in the Gulf of Alaska and off the coast of California, we cannot designate critical habitat in those areas. However, there's usually some type of a conservation management plan in place for Department of Defense lands that ensure that listed entities that are in those areas are managed well. And that's beyond the scope of this discussion, but there's a whole lot of information that you can find on that if you're interested. And lastly, there can be other exemptions or exclusions, and these are at the discretion of the management agency. So now that we've listed our critical habitat, what are some of the benefits that we can see come from this designation? Well, federal agencies are only one form of managers. You have state managers, you have local managers, counties. So by designating critical habitat, it helps make other managers aware of habitat that is important for listed entities and may help them in their management decisions. Additionally, you could stimulate volunteer conservation research and education and outreach. So if folks know that somewhere, an area, a beach is part of critical habitat for a species or an entity, they're more likely to take care of that. And maybe a grad student's going to go out and conduct some research to figure out how important this essential feature really is to the entity. And it's possible that a critical habitat designation may help shape priorities when responding to events such as oil spills. So if an oil spill occurs in a large general area and part of that is designated as critical habitat, it may be that the folks that are responding will prioritize critical habitat for response over other areas that may not be critical habitat. This is not always the case, but it is a possibility. So the public, how can everyone be involved in this process? We understand how an entity is listed, and we saw that there's a couple comment periods in there. And now for designating critical habitat, there are also a few ways that the public can give their opinion. And the first is to put in written comments on a proposed designation of critical habitat. So during this public comment period, you can write in comments either in a letter that you send in snail mail, or through an online system, you can submit your comments. And these are addressed and they are looked at and will be responded to in the final designation of critical habitat. The other way is by testifying at public hearings. So I mentioned earlier that there will be public hearings for ringed and bearded seals next week, February 23rd, 24th, and 25th. And these will start at 4 p.m. and conclude no later than 7. And this is going to be a telephone hearing, which is not the way that we prefer to hold these hearings, but due to the pandemic and us wanting to keep everybody safe, this is kind of the only option we have. But I've included the telephone number and the conference code, and those will be good for all 3 days. And even though we've sort of broken it out by region for the different days, you can call into any or all of these hearings, and we encourage you to call into any or all of them. If you have something to say, we want to hear it. The information that NOAA Fisheries will be presenting at the beginning of the hearing will be the same all 3 days. The difference will be the type of testimonies that we get from different folks. So again, I encourage you to call in. What'll happen is you will call in and you'll be muted automatically. But after you hear the presentation by biologists, they will give you instructions on how you can raise your hand sort of on the phone and be given the chance to provide your testimony. All right, so we've talked about how an entity gets listed. We talked about how its critical habitat gets designated. Let's kind of tie all of this together and look at some local examples of marine mammals in Alaska. So the North Pacific right whale. This is one of those larger species that was overexploited by commercial whaling. So the population is really, really small. And quite frankly, this is one of those we don't know situations. However, we do know enough about it to know that it's an essential feature is the presence of specific prey. In fact, they really like copepods and these little shrimp. And based on our knowledge of the Alaskan waters, we've identified a couple areas. There is a small rectangular area just south of Kodiak Island and a larger area in the Bering Sea. We know that their prey tend to congregate there, and we also, through underwater sound collection, totally losing my words here, but anyway, we're able to tell, we've heard North Pacific right whales in these areas, and we've also had visual confirmation. So we know that these are places that have the prey that they want and allow them to feed. Now, for species that we know more about, such as the Cook Inlet beluga, there are a lot more essential features that we've been able to determine. I'm not going to read all of these out loud to you right now, but if you kind of look over the list, we've got physical features such as the depth of the water and the closeness to a stream where it might find primary prey, which is one of its biological features that it needs. Also needs water free of toxins, which I think most of us probably do, but some species are much more sensitive than others. There needs to be unrestricted passage between critical habitat areas. So you'll notice on this map that there are a lot of streams and rivers and more secluded areas that if we were to build, say, a dam across one of these, it would prohibit belugas from traveling up that area and being able to feed on their prey. And lastly, they need in-water noise levels that are low enough that they're not going to cause them to desert their critical habitat and go somewhere else. And if you know anything about Cook Inlet, it's a pretty loud place, so that's a tricky one to tackle. The last species I'm going to talk about are stellar sea lions. And originally these were listed as the entire species, but in 1997, I believe, we split them into two different distinct population segments. The eastern, which is east of 144 latitude or Cape Suckling, the eastern distinct population segment ended up being delisted in 2013. So one thing I didn't mention earlier is that an entity can be listed, it can be downlisted, uplisted, or delisted. So just because something is listed under the Endangered Species Act doesn't mean that it will always be under the Endangered Species Act. And just like we designate critical habitat, it doesn't always stay critical habitat. So there is a reverse process for all of this. But back to the sea lions. So now only the Western distinct population segment of sea lions are currently listed as endangered. And for their critical habitat, it was recognized that rookeries and haulouts are where they're the most sensitive. And so if you look on this map, the black dots are their haulout locations, and the red stars, which probably just look like dots, those are rookeries where they go to breed and raise the pups. And so their essential features are based around these rookeries. And the first is that there is a terrestrial zone that extends just under 1,000 meters back onto the shoreline. So that way there's protection from the backside, because if something were to come up and disturb sea lions, they could potentially stampede into the water, killing individuals, or pups could be split from their mothers, leading to pup fatality. There's also an air zone that extends about 1,000 meters above, preventing aircraft and drones and other things from getting too close and disturbing these areas. The third bullet that we have here actually pertains to the Eastern distinct population segment, so we're not going to cover that. But below it, it talks about an aquatic zone for these Western rookeries and haulouts, and it involves a zone that extends 20 nautical miles seaward from each haulout and rookery. And these are designated by this blue shading that you see around each of the dots. There are also 3 specific or special aquatic foraging areas that were designated. In the lavender here is Shelikof Strait, which goes in between the mainland and Kodiak Island. There's also the Boguslav area, which is here out in the Aleutians, and this small little maroon area, which is Seguam Pass. And these have been identified as areas that are very important for stellar sea lion feeding. Now, there is some confusion about stellar sea lions and fisheries regulations, and this is a very complicated process that I have to be honest, I'm not all that familiar with. But I do want to say that the ESA process for designating critical habitat does not put restrictions on fisheries into place. It was recognized that for the conservation good of the stellar sea lions, prohibiting fishing from some areas was a good idea. And so the ESA designation came first, the critical habitat came first, and later on fisheries regulations were put into place. So it is not always the case that there are regulations where there is also critical habitat. This is kind of an exception and definitely not the rule. So a few take-home points that I want to go over is that critical habitat is essential to the conservation of threatened and endangered entities. In a lot of cases, critical habitat might be the one thing that helps a species to recover. And critical habitat designation identifies important habitat areas, but it does not prohibit human activities such as subsistence fishing, hunting, fishing, and other similar activities. So these are all still good to go. I cannot bring home enough that critical habitat designation does not affect human activities. What critical habitat does do, as a reminder, is it gets the federal agencies together and makes us consult on federal actions. So we want to make sure that there's no destruction or adverse modification of critical habitat areas. And lastly, you can be involved, not only in the designation process, but also in the listing process. You can submit written comments, and you can also go to public hearings and voice your opinion. Now, I do want to say that you can still submit written comments for the bearded and ring-sealed proposed critical habitat, and you can either do that. I don't think I put actually I did put the website on here, I believe. So let me skip ahead here. I have a few reference websites. One is public hearings for ringed and bearded seals, the ESA listing process, critical habitat designation process. And then also, if you are interested in submitting written comments for ringed and bearded seals, each species has its own website that you can go to, and it will give you instructions on how to submit those comments. They'll go over this in much more detail during the hearings next week, but I just wanted to let you know. And I believe that the deadline for public comment has been extended from March into April. And with that, I really hope that I've clarified a little bit what critical habitat is and what it means to you, what it means to the listed entities, that you have a better understanding of the Endangered Species Act and what happens with that act. And I encourage you to check out the hearings next week if you're interested in the designation process. And at this point, I will do my best to answer any questions that you might have. And I really appreciate your attention this evening.
All right, thank you, Jenna. I think we should have you back to explain all federal processes. That was very good. You laid it out. You've already got a question. So the first question is, why are some marine mammals under one agency and others are under another? And that is a good question. Thank you, Carol Gales.
That is a great question. And I think at one point I may have known the answer to this. And there was a thought at one point that all animals would be under one agency, but I can't remember exactly why. I think fisheries themselves, like the actual, not NOAA fisheries, but fisheries were under one agency and other wildlife was under another. But I honestly am not entirely sure about that, but I can find out and get back to you. I personally, it's very confusing and can be very frustrating, especially when you're in a state where you're hunting and fishing different species managed by different folks. It is definitely a confusion point for sure.
All right, thank you. And I don't know if you want to stop share on your
I can do that. If I can figure out how to do that.
On the bottom bar. Good. There you go. All right, any other questions? I know I have a question. Does anyone want to get in there before me though and get their question to Jenna on critical habitat?
Yes, this is Wes Jones, if I may.
Yes, go Wes.
Okay, yeah, my question, I just want to clarify, you say that the critical habitat, just the way the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and then NOAA Fisheries, the way they implement these habitat, the critical habitat, they each do them in the same way. Is that correct?
Yes, that is my understanding. Now we might do things a little bit differently between the agencies, but the process that we go through in terms of determining where the critical habitat should be, that should be similar. And we all have different styles of management, but ideally we are doing things the same way.
Okay. And then if I may, just one other question was, what is once critical habitat has been set in this time of so much change and species moving farther north, what is the process, or has there been a process set up to reevaluate critical habitats, and how do they go about looking at moving, say, having critical habitats farther north and remove some to the south or something such as that?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I know for listed entities, we have to do a 5-year review. So we revisit the status of an entity every 5 years. And I don't want to misspeak and say that critical habitat is included in that, but I do know that we do review critical habitat. You can petition the agencies if you have an opinion that, for example, you think critical habitat has changed because all of a sudden ribbon seals or some other species are showing up where you've never seen them before. So we can review critical habitat based on a petition, or if we receive information or we have scientific information that suggests that we should be doing a revision. I don't know for sure if we do it again on that 5-year basis, but I can find that out for you and let you know.
Does that help, Wes?
Yes, it does. And I'll let other people ask questions now, and then so thank you.
Okay, feel free to swing back around in. And actually, I had a question that was very similar to Wes's, and that is that, you know, as he was saying, we have these tremendous, in the Bering Strait region, we have tremendous transition going on right now, and we have things that we've never experienced with animal shifts, fish shifts, bird shifts. And so I was wondering, I think you gave a great answer to Wes. My question is, if you delist an animal, does that null and void the critical habitat? I mean, I guess it must, because it wouldn't be critical if the animal is delisted. Is that how you?
Yes, my understanding is that the critical habitat would no longer be necessary, and I'm not sure if there has to be a separate, I would assume separate sort of designation process. It's not something that I've experienced yet in my career, so I'm not sure about that one. But yeah, if the species is no longer listed, then there would be no need for the critical habitat.
Okay, so by default, that would go away.
I think so. Granted, it might be separate processes. So, because for a downlisting or a delisting, we have to go through the rulemaking process and all of that legal jumbo that we have to do. So it's likely we probably have to do that for critical habitat as well.
Okay. All right. Let's take another question from somebody. Anybody have a question for Henna? Colleen writes that, on the window. She's curious about large ships and icebreakers in ring seal habitat. How would designating critical habitat affect these kind of large scale and international activities? Boy, there's a question that's timely for this region right now. Thank you, Colleen.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And Gay was just filling me in earlier this week about the current situation. So in terms of critical habitat and in any international activities, we can't necessarily do a whole lot about that because it has to do with a federal action, and international is not, they're not federal agencies that we consult with, if that makes sense. Just as we don't designate critical habitat internationally, we can't necessarily enforce critical habitat with international partners. At least I don't believe we can. That's a really great question, and I don't know if it's something that we've really looked into or really thought much about at this point, because the critical habitat isn't designated yet. But yeah, unfortunately, I will say I've had questions about, if critical habitat designation can stop projects from moving forward. So say stop shipping and things like that. There have been very, very few cases in which critical habitat or a listed entity have actually stopped a project from going forward. Part of the consultation process that we do is to try to come up with mitigation measures and ways that the project can move forward without causing these bad impacts on either critical habitat or a listed entity. So it's a critical habitat designation isn't going to stop the tankers, I guess is kind of what I want to say. It's very unlikely that will be the case, at least as critical habitat is written now. However, that could change in the future because these tankers coming through is more frequent, and it's a new problem that we all have to figure out how to deal with. And so that may change in the future.
Right, thank you. Good answer. And hopefully, Colleen, that gets at what you're looking for. You have another question from Austin Amosik. Was there someone who wanted to say something? Go ahead. Would be my echo. Yeah.
I think it was your echo. But I see Austin's question, and yeah, thank you for that, Austin. So public comments.
We do have, sorry, Jenna, we do have someone calling in. That's why it's good to, if you see it, read it out, because the person who's calling in can't see the screen.
Got you. So Austin's question was, will NOAA Fisheries post public comments so there's transparency in the public record, or will comments be summarized? That is a good question to which I do not have a good answer. It depends. If we end up with a lot of very similar comments from different folks, those sometimes will be summarized and kind of put all together and answered at once, as opposed to answering different variations of the same question. So I guess it really depends on the question that or the comment that you provide with us. If it's something that nobody else has done, your comment will be in there. It'll be addressed directly. However, again, it depends on how similar it is to other comments, because in cases where we receive hundreds or maybe even thousands of public comments, trying to respond to each one individually would be very challenging. So I wish I had a better answer for you, Austin, but thank you for that question.
So you sort of sort them out? Is that how that works? Into piles and then say, seems to be a real question and it only gets answered once? Is there some way that the public would say, wow, they had so many, it's not just one answer, but that represents 1,000 people or something like that? Is that, or is it just, that's the answer to that category?
Again, I think it depends. If you have a bunch of people that are asking, in a different way, how did you decide on this particular central feature, but they're asking in different ways. They might say, okay, here's the general idea of all these comments and here's our response. And if there's very specific things, I think we try to cover those in our response. But I have not been through this process yet. I'm actually working on a listing petition myself, but we haven't gotten to this point yet. So I'll know more when this process is over.
All right, well, thank you. And thank you for your answer. And thank you, Austin, too, for your question. Sounds like it's underway. All right. Yeah, we did the critical habitat moving. And I guess I had my last question would be for, you mentioned under Endangered Species Act, the animals can be listed in as endangered under Endangered Species Act. That's like, that's bad. And then kind of yellow light is threatened. And then is there depleted? Is that under ESA or what is depleted? Is that like the kind of the green
That's
light?
Marine Mammal Protection Act.
Oh, that's in the
That's
Marine Protection Act. Okay. So
yeah, that's the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So they can be listed as depleted under the MMPA, or so it's either threatened or endangered under ESA, and then the Marine Mammal Protection Act is the depleted category.
okay. So if you're depleted, it doesn't trigger a critical habitat designation.
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. Only the Endangered Species Act can do that.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you for explaining this. This was really good for me. I hope it was good for everybody else. So let me tell you that it is not easy to be a straight science speaker. And if there's no other comments, throw Jenna some love in that chat box there. Go. Sorry, Wes. Go ahead. We're not done with questions, but still, while Wes is asking, throw something in there if you want to.
Yes, sorry.
Sorry, Wes. Go ahead.
I do have another question.
Yes. Sorry.
I find it interesting. Yeah, okay. Yes. I find it, Jenna. I find it. I find it interesting that one of the activities you highlighted, that commercial fishing is not, not curtailed by critical habitat. But here in Norton Sound, one of the issues that we've run into is in eastern Norton Sound, we have spectacled eider critical habitat. While nothing of the commercial fishing activity of actually harvesting the fish isn't affected, but the one that we've run into is that DEC, because of the rules placed on them by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, will not issue processing permits, so we cannot discharge the fish waste of the guts and things like that that are ground, that they will not issue discharge permits. So that in effect you may say that the commercial fishing is still allowed, but because they won't allow the processing aspect of it, or they won't allow that discharge permit, in effect it is. Would you have any? I guess I'm just asking, curious if you have comments on that aspect.
Yeah, I am not familiar with that particular, with the spectacled eiders or their critical habitat. And was it spectacled or stellars? I can't remember. There's too many eiders. Spectacled. Yeah. So I'm aware of that.
It's spectacled.
Okay. Yeah. I don't have a good answer for you. I hate to say I don't know, but I'm really unfamiliar with how Fish and Wildlife, how they might treat critical habitat and the types of things that they might tack on with that. Yeah, I really wish I
Is
could
there a,
say something helpful.
is there, no, and that's good because you're
Yeah.
NOAA and that's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife bird. But is there someone that you could think of that maybe would take Wes's question and be able to run with it a little more so he could get a better understanding or answer? Or
Yeah, I have a contact at Fish and Wildlife Service who may not be able to answer this question, but I could find out from him who could answer this question. So Wes, if you would be comfortable sharing your contact info, maybe in the chat or something, I can do a little research and try to get you the right person to talk to.
or you can email. I know Wes. You can either just send it because I'm kind of
Okay,
curious too. Is that all right, Wes?
perfect.
Wes?
Yeah, she could just send it to you, but I'll go ahead and give her my
Yeah,
email
okay.
address. I'm putting my email address in the chat too.
Yeah.
But she could send it through
Great,
you.
thank you.
That would be great.
And I also have put in the chat the those website, one of the 3 websites. So the first one was information where to go make your public comment. That's the NOAA fisheries site, public hearing, proposed critical habitat, Arctic ring seals and Beringia distinct. And then I put in the one for the ring seals, and that website gives you the map of the area that they're talking about for ring seals. And also I threw in the bearded seal, which gives you the map and some of the information on the upcoming for the upcoming comment period and how to get at that either by phone or by mail or by this sort of thing, internet.
Yeah, Gay, I did just see that Austin had another question asking if a person could submit multiple comments during both telephonic hearings. So I guess, Austin, for clarification, are you asking about submitting multiple comments during one hearing or submitting a comment during one hearing and then calling in the next day and submitting another comment? So I just want to make sure I answer your question.
Yeah, so what if a person, thinks of something the second time around that was said during the first period and they want to rebut or make another claim or provide additional evidence?
I don't know that there would be a problem with that because you are welcome to call into any of them. I don't know if they would have a restriction on folks. Granted, I will say that in the instance, so let's say you give you make a comment on day 1 and then you want to make a comment day 2, they will probably prioritize people who have not commented yet. And so if there is then time for additional comments or questions, then that would be okay. I guess my thought is they want to make sure everybody gets a chance to say their piece once. And so if they end up having a full set of folks that are talking up until 7 o'clock, you might not have a chance to say something the second day. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to be able to say something. I think that they will prioritize. I know they're prioritizing elders and folks that have restrictions on time to make sure that their voices are heard. But if you're able to stick around and they get to the point where they're done or they're asking for questions, I don't see why you wouldn't be able to submit another comment.
All right. Well, thank you. Hopefully, Austin, does that answer?
Jenna said I could, so it could.
All right.
Oh, don't you go there.
All right. Any other? Because I don't feel rushed. Jenna's being a good sport with all these questions, and I think it's really great to get the questions answered. Where in the Bering, this is a trick question, where in the Bering Strait do we have critical habitat? Anybody can speak up on this one. We have 3 different animals that I know of that we are in their critical habitat that has been, established. Does anyone know what those are? One is
This is Wes. I'll say that for spectacled eiders, you have Eastern Norton Sound. You have a fall time in Eastern Norton Sound for spectacled eiders, and then you have critical habitat south of St. Lawrence Island for spectacled eiders.
great. Thanks, Wes.
Hi, this is Liz. I was just going to chime in too that the Ledged Bay area is also one of the regions that is designated critical habitat for spectacled eiders, typically in August, September, when the birds could be in there molting.
Thank you, Liz. And yes, and Ledyard Bay is up in the northeast Chukchi. That's kind of between Point Lay and Wainwright, if I'm not mistaken. So
Yep.
thank you for that. There's polar bear. We're all living in the polar bear habitat, critical habitat in the Bering Strait region. Anybody get the NOAA species? She actually had it up on the board. It's actually 2 on St. Lawrence Island in 1994. I want to say there are 2 areas of St. Lawrence Island that were designated critical habitat for the Steller sea lion. One is Southwest Cape Murphy Bay area, and the other is Ingalik Island, which is in the Punuk Island complex. It's the most furthest west. And in those locations, I think you mentioned it, Jenna, but my ears were tuned to it, there's a 25 mile or 20 mile?
20 nautical mile, 23 mile, depending on which metric you want to
Okay.
use.
But a 20 mile buffer for no commercial pollock fishing. I think that's correct.
Pollock fishing, and then there's a few others. It's Pacific cod, hook and line, and pot fishing, I believe.
Okay, that's good to know.
I think, don't quote me on that, but it's something with cod. I can't remember exactly which
Long
methods it
lining,
was.
probably. Long lining and pots. Is probably what that is. All right. Well, thank you. That was just a local quiz on critical habitat. That's all I know. But I've learned tons, and you have a great way of untangling the Gordian knot of federal regulations. So please come back and help us with the next one. Seriously, very, very great job. And you got a lot of very nice comments on the back. So thank you to the audience as well. Any last questions?
Thank you for all of the great questions. I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry I didn't have better answers to some of your questions. So yeah, you can always email me and I can follow up with you. So
that's all right. Out here, we're all in it together. So we'll figure something out. And thank you, Jenna. And it sounds like you will get back in touch with us with a couple things. I saw you write those down. So
yep.
Wonderful. All right. And with that, we'll say good night. Thank you all for coming. Next week, I do want to say next week we have Dan Rizzolo on Thursday night. He's going to be talking about spectacled eider and what the eiders are actually doing during the low ice years of 2018, 2019. What happened to them? They're a species we normally have off of St. Lawrence Island, and he has information that will tell us what happens when you take away the ice. So thank you all. Hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you so much, Jenna.